Welcome to Battery Powered Expert Night. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jill Minkus. I am the Director of Grants and Impact. So this is our first theme event of 2021, and it is our first event in our climate action theme. And I don't know about you all, but I'm feeling pretty good about getting our arms around this issue at this particular moment in our history. Climate action is a vast topic, right? In every way. You know, we know that the impacts of a warming climate on human health, on our security, on our livelihoods are pervasive, and they're accelerating. And, you know, as they are on other species, plants, animals, and on our ecosystems. So if summer of 2020 is, you know, already a distant and hazy memory, I think we only need to look to last week's evacuations in Santa Cruz County to remind us that that a warming climate contributes to the frequency and the duration and the intensity of wildfires. That's just one example that's hitting us really close to home right now. The solutions that we need to prevent even more serious consequences, like potentially catastrophic consequences in some cases, are maybe they're not countless, but they're numerous. So whether we are talking about halting fossil fuel extraction and production, or expanding renewable energy, or, you know, promoting sustainable agriculture and curbing deforestation, we might be talking about diversifying economies in communities in coal country, or elevating community-determined climate resilience plans. But no matter what that solution is, we need to be doing it faster than we've done it in the past, and we need to be doing it at scale. And we have this vast challenge of doing the work in a way that's equitable. So doing it in a way where in the future, unlike in the past and unlike right now, there aren't certain populations and communities that are consistently getting hit first and worst by climate impacts, and doing it in a way where all communities can benefit from some of these solutions we're going to be talking about. So that's a tall order. Fortunately, we have 4 extraordinary panelists and 1 crackerjack moderator who are going to help us at least begin to answer the question that is going to guide our learning over the next couple of months. And that is, what will it take to create a sustainable and equitable climate future? So before I turn it over to our moderator and our panelists, just a couple of items of housekeeping. I know you're all bored by this probably at this point because we're 10 months in, but this is a webinar, which means that you audience are not on mic and you are not on video, so you don't have to worry that we can hear you calling your dog or having a glass of wine or anything like that. The conversation among the panelists is going to last about an hour, and then they will be answering questions from the audience at, you know, starting at around 7:05, 7:10. We're going to use the Q&A function to submit your questions. So if at any point while folks are talking, you have a question for one or more of our panelists, pop it into that Q&A, use the Q&A box. And then when we come back at 7:05, 7:10, we'll get through as many of those as possible in a 20-minute period. What else? We do have the chat feature on. That's going to be used more for your reactions and for us to share links. If our panelists mention some resource that's interesting, please be respectful. The folks who will be talking tonight are really going to be focused on the conversation, so they won't necessarily have a chance to be answering anything that you put in chat, but know that we're tracking it. I think that's it for the housekeeping. So I will be back during Q&A But right now I'm going to, one, turn off this screen share, and to go behind the veil and hand the reins over to our moderator for the evening, Colleen Gregerson, Battery Powered's Executive Director. Colleen, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jill, for that great introduction. I guess I am to be the Cracker Jack moderator that you mentioned, so I will do my very best. It's really an honor to be here tonight to moderate this panel of really phenomenal folks, and I can't wait to jump into the discussion and share what they have to say with all of you folks that are joining us from your home. So we're going to do just that. We're going to jump right in. I do want to briefly introduce these four folks. I will never be able to do them justice in the time we have, so my apologies for extremely abbreviated bios for these four extraordinary individuals. I'm going to go in the order that you appear on my screen. I'm going to start with Jared Blumenfeld. He is the California's Secretary for Environmental Protection, where he oversees our state's efforts to fight climate change. Before this role, he served as the Regional Administrator of the United States EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, under President Obama for the Pacific Southwest region. And before that, for those of you who are native San Franciscos, you might recall when he was the Director of San Francisco's Department of Environment under then Mayor Newsom. I hear he hosts a podcast called Podship Earth. I have not listened to it, but I love the name and I'm super excited to look it up and listen to you on your podcast. Thank you, Jared, for being here tonight. Next, we have Miya Yoshitani, who is the Executive Director of the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, also known as APEN. This is an organization that is building the leadership and power of low-income Asian American and Pacific Islander immigrant and refugee communities to be at the center of solutions to the climate crisis. She brings decades to this role and an extensive background in community organizing and campaign strategy for the environmental justice movement. We're so pleased to have you with us tonight, Miya. Next, we want to give a big thank you to Corinne Van Hook Turner. If you all have been following our social media posts, you know that this is a surprise guest. We were to have our dear friend Pandora Thomas on the panel tonight, but she was unable to join. But she served us up this phenomenal special guest, which is Corinne Van Hook Turner, and we couldn't be more pleased to have you with us tonight. Corinne is the Director of Climate Innovation at the Movement Strategy Center. She brings a lens of racial equity to transformative movement building. She has over 15 years of experience with movements for social, economic, and racial equity. Earlier roles are numerous, but they include serving as a scholar with the Initiative for Diversity in Education and Leadership and as a co-director of Rooted in Resilience. And last, but certainly not least, we have Ivan Frishberg, who is the Director of Impact Policy for Amalgamated Bank and Amalgamated Charitable Foundation. He leads their impact work, including the bank's carbon and climate commitments and innovative approaches to measurement of the bank's social and environmental impact. Before this role, he was the Senior Advisor and Climate Change Campaign Manager for Organizing for America, or Organizing for Action, excuse me, a Senior Advisor to the Climate Action Campaign, and he brings 25 years of public interest advocacy, organizing, and policy experience. So you all are left with no doubt now that we are in very good hands this evening for our discussion. Thank you all for being with us. I want to start by getting to know each of you a little bit more and our audience getting to know you. So I'd like to start by asking each of you to answer this question. And maybe Jared, I'll ask you to go first if you don't mind. Can you just tell us why you do this work that you do?
First of all, hi to everyone, Miya and Corinne and Ivan and you, Colleen. Good to see you, and thanks everyone for joining. It's a pretty great title, Battery Powered. So I don't know if whoever came up with that is a genius in marketing. So why I do it, I think at a the different levels. At the most passionate level, it's just really loving life on the planet, and whether that's human life and our families or life of abundance around us. I love hiking and being out in nature and realizing that we have put this entire web of life in jeopardy, and that this isn't. I mean, it's I think Colleen kind of framed this up, but this is no longer a time where it's like a activity that we can stand on the sidelines. Like this really is a question when people talk about existentialism in the context of climate change. It's real, and so for me, I feel very urgent, and I feel stressed that what we're doing is kind of marching towards the edge of a cliff, and unless we take really bold, decisive action, the generations that follow us will be diminished. The life on the planet will be diminished. So this is as big as that, and it feels like we can only, as Jill teed it up, like we won't be effective at solving this problem unless we do it in an equitable way. Like the reasons that we got to where we are now are because of systemic issues that include racism and inequality, and we can't use those things to get to where we're going. So for me, this is about life on the planet, and I know that sounds probably to some of you like cliched and maybe overused, but the more you look at the science, the more you look at what's happening around us, the more you see our agency is in charge of cleaning up after the wildfires, and I'll end on this. We spent last year $2.5 billion cleaning up the wildfires. So people used to think that the price of taking action was too high. The price of not taking action is incredibly high. And California, unfortunately, we're on the front lines of both the impacts and a long history of trying to deal with this issue. But even where we are now, even with the Biden administration coming in and a sense of hope, we really, really have a lot to do.
Thank you, Jared. I loved how you started that you were in this work because you're loving life on the planet. It's a beautiful way to start our conversation. Miya, can I turn to you for the same question? Why do you do the work you do?
Sure. I mean, some very similar things. I do the work that I do because my life, because the lives of people and communities that I care the most about in the world, really, we all depend on a future where we can all be free, where we have clean air, clean water, good jobs, thriving neighborhoods, and a stable climate. I mean, and without what we're doing now, we don't have that future to look forward to. And we don't also have the opportunity to address massive inequality. I mean, just bringing it more personally, I was really lucky to grow up in a household that actually acknowledged that we live in a country that's not fair and it's not equal, and that part of what makes you a good and decent person is to care about inequality. I grew up in a very white suburb in the Midwest, very much an outsider, not just because of my race or ethnicity, but also because my family was pretty progressive and that really set us apart. But it turned me into a fighter. And also my dad, who was an environmental engineer, and he had a specialty with cleaning up hazardous waste sites and Superfund sites, and which was not cool and sexy back in the 80s. But I did learn through his work how much industry has been allowed to pollute and poison certain communities and not so much in others. And that really helped me to find the fight for environmental justice and become an organizer. From when I was a teenager, I was really drawn to social movements and movements for social change and movements that had really big transformative visions. And I feel like right now is when we need those movements the most. And so I feel committed to building that future for the people that I care about. And I've also got pretty good job security right now because we really need these powerful movements, and that's the business that I'm in.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. Corinne, could I turn to you for the same question? Why do you do this work?
Yes. Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Miya. Again, I share a lot of those sentiments that have been named. And I think that as I think about like all the different reasons why I do this work, and why I'm in this work, I think about like recently, you know, I don't know if you've seen like the hoodies that are, because it's now being commercialized, is really just the connection to my ancestors and to my ancestry, and both that being familial, cultural, and ecological. And you know, where I feel most in my power, where I feel most on purpose and aligned with my values. Particularly understanding that growing up all my life, like this is really the work that, whether I recognized it or not, then growing up as a child, being a woman of color in this system that is inequitable, and feeling the exacerbated impacts that climate has now brought to both economic, social, institutional inequities, that it's really what I've been doing, you know, whether it professionally. And so I think that it took a moment, you know, in college for me to say, like, this is the work that I'm actually built to do. I'm here to like intervene and know that a transition that are aligned with my values to a better world that meets everyone is possible. And I'm not going to do that growing up. Yes, I grew up in a low income, and you know, I was raised to get an education, and I had, you know, I was lucky enough to get a scholarship to attend college. I probably wouldn't have attended college. You know, my dad, you know, was on Section 8 and we were very low income. And it was like, you're the daughter that needs to kind of go to school. And I think at the time I wanted to be a lawyer and like make money and like just buy into this capital mindset, right? Which we know has a relationship to our exacerbated climate emergency, right? And so there was just a lot of disalignment with that. And it took a while for me to understand that, oh, I'm not failing by doing what I'm supposed to do. I'm actually doing what I'm called to do, and what's necessary, and what's gonna kind of establish a safer place for not just my family, but you know, the communities that I'm in. And also just seeing time and time again that, especially with people of color, we're oftentimes extracted, you know, from our communities to buy into this system of capitalism and what defines success, and without actually going back to our communities and making it better, right? And continuing the work and continuing the movement building, and that's essential. It's essential for our social cohesion. It's essential for our fabric, and it gives me joy to be able to do this work. I don't think that if I was clocking 12 plus hours, you know, in a legal firm, I would probably be this happy. And not to say that it's not hard work, but it's necessary. And I think, again, like what the beginning of this year has taught, has shown us with the inauguration is that, you know, what a window of people, power and community leadership and really doing that work can make possible. So that's why I do it, in a nutshell. Like, we are the ones we've been waiting for and all that stuff. And yeah, I've felt and experienced all of this, and I feel like I should be playing a role to leave a legacy for what I can contribute to changing things.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that, for your story, Corinne. Ivan, last but certainly not least, why are you in this work?
Thanks, Colleen, and thanks everybody for being here tonight and turning yourself to this issue. It's an honor to be battery powered and to be among this great group of panelists. I guess why I do this work, I sort of have like two cliches that I'll sort of smoosh together. The first is a totally geeky one, which is I saw Al Gore do his PowerPoint presentation right before there was a movie, and it is, you know, it's like cold hard Al Gore fact, you know, and it's just an incredibly, even back then, right? This must have been 2005 or 6, and it was a Democratic Congressional House Caucus retreat, and it's just powerful. And I saw those members who were pretty craven, relational, you know, transactional politicians kind of moved by this stuff, and it certainly had an impact on me. And then a couple of years later, my first daughter was born, and you start to kind of have this sort of like, holy crap, there's this crisis. It's just the clarity around the issues involved with it are so stunning and clear. And then you're kind of confronted with, you know, a future that's now right in front of you. And that was, I think around 2008, I said, okay, that's it. This is the issue I work on for the rest of my life. And so I've had a lot of jobs since then, but it's all been around climate change. So that's why I'm so excited to be here.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. Well, now that we know a little bit more about you all, we're going to dive right into the meat of this. Now, I had, you know, I'm a nerd. I do like all my prep work before I moderate these things. And I had a whole plan to start with this discussion on all these questions about policy. You know, we have a brand new presidential administration indicating, you know, that they're going to take some action around climate, and, you know, government is a very important part of action for the climate. But I had my prep calls with these experts, and they, to a T, totally disabused me of the notion that change starts with policy, and that actually change starts with people. And also, let's not forget that government and markets are made up of people as well. And so that we really needed to talk about people power first. Now, we've been talking about this kind of moment of opportunity that we're in right now. And that really is, as these folks have shared with me, because of the deep engagement and momentum of people pushing for change. So I'm taking our experts' advice and starting here. Miya, I'm going to kick this question to you, but I know that you all have a lot to say around this topic, so please chime in. We can have a conversation. But Miya, I wanted to ask you if you can talk about how people power has brought us to this very moment of opportunity around climate action.
Yeah, well, we could teach a full year of courses on social movements and why people power is at the center. But I think it's one of the best things about this moment is actually we have this amazing example to look at that explains this very clearly by looking at Georgia and looking at not just the election results, but right now this new administration has actually a fighting chance to begin to address climate change, because Black-led organizing supported by people of color and immigrants and young people and working people built the power on the ground to win. And this didn't happen overnight. It wasn't accidental. It was very well strategized and very well planned. And it wasn't done single-handedly by any one person. As amazing and incredible and transformational as Stacey Abrams is, she didn't do this by herself. It was decades of organizing, person by person, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, that was driven by a vision that was rooted in local communities. And it wasn't driven by a national organization. It wasn't driven by a political party. It was years and years of hard organizing work by people with a vision for their communities who are deeply invested in a collective and liberated future. And being able to have that example of Georgia right in front of us, I think is a great, it's amazing for this moment, because it really is a very clear demonstration that's all very clear in our heads about how people power was actually able to get us to this point of new opportunity. Not saying that we have won everything we need to win, but it has opened up the possibility of transformation in a way that we have not been able to take for granted for, you know, in particular the last 4 years, but for decades. So very glad that we had that inspirational example. Just, you know, this is one example, but it's great to look at how, you know, grassroots and community organizing, worker organizing, that's how any significant social change has been achieved in the US for all of history. So it's how my organization was able to grow from a local organizing project in the Lao refugee community in Richmond, California 25 years ago, a fence line community, to the Richmond oil refinery, one of the biggest local polluters, one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gases in the state. but how we were able to build real power at this intersection of racism, poverty, and pollution with other join with other communities around the state who are facing the same issues, other folks around the country. And now it's this part of the movement that is the driving force behind equitable climate change, equitable solutions to the climate crisis. So it's fundamentally about power. The people who are closest to the problem, who have the best solutions to this and the combined crisis that we're facing, the pandemic, the economic crisis, the housing crisis here in the Bay Area, white supremacy, authoritarianism, and the climate crisis is all related, all cumulative, all threatening the same communities of color and the same working families, and also the same communities who, when organized, like in Georgia, have the actual power to deliver transformative policy and real social change. So we are at this moment where we've been able to kind of pull ourselves back from the precipice of something really, really terrifying and awful. And now we're standing here on that edge, and how we're going to move forward depends on the power that we're able to build in the communities who are most impacted by this crisis. And it's both an amazing moment and a frightening moment to be in, because we have so little time to waste. But there are no shortcuts to organizing for power. And that is the only way through this, is to support that community-led grassroots organizing that is going to center on the solutions that we need.
Thank you, Miya. Ivan, I was hoping to turn to you for a minute, because you have shared with me some really enlightening things about the power of people when it comes to the marketplace as well, and market action. And I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about the intersection of those two pieces and the importance of that in this moment right now.
Yeah. And where Miya sort of was left this in terms of people organizing and power, I feel like when it comes to policy, right, and the job that Jared has to do trying to move policy in a political environment, the pace of change that we need to sort of work under, the scale of the change that we need to work under, is going to cause incredible friction and friction within the economy, right? We're trying to move from an extractive economy, both fossil fuels and people, and totally turn this thing on its head. And so, we have to do that from an emissions standpoint, like, cut our emissions in half in 10 years. From a human standpoint, we need to have done it like decades ago. And so, but the friction that we're about to experience around this issue, we can only get through that and move companies and move the politics of this issue if we kind of keep up that power that Miya is talking about. I'll just, from the kind of private sector example of this, I get two climate examples. One is the reason we have a Green New Deal, and the reason it defined the entire Democratic presidential field, is because a bunch of pissed off young people decided to do what was probably unthinkable in San Francisco, to like do a sit-in outside Speaker Pelosi's office and just lay it down, right? And that moment and sort of catalyzed a lot of the conversation that's been brewing for a long time around the Green New Deal. And that was just the power of sort of youth energy, and it was transformative. At the last climate week that was like in person in New York, Greta Thunberg spoke and at the United Nations, and I think people probably remember what it was, a very powerful and pissed off speech. The next day, we at the bank were hosting a meeting of people from the banking industry that were focused on sustainability, and they represented mostly large global banks, and they're sitting in our training room, and the facilitator asked, okay, I just want you to describe your name and your role in climate. And almost immediately, people started to talk about the issue, and they started to cry. And the room just opened right up. And people were thinking, I don't know how I talk to my kids about this. I don't know how I talk to my coworkers about this. I should be running down the hall screaming and shouting. I would quit, except for somebody who's worse is going to come along. Like I mean, it was, people were going through this real crisis. And I think it was because many of them work at institutions that are funding hundreds of billions of dollars into the fossil fuel industry, and they know that. These people know about the issue. They care about their kids and their families, and they see these issues like we all do. And it was, in many ways, it was a young person, Greta Thunberg, who kind of forced them to confront what was happening in their lives. And so I feel like we're going to need a lot of that energy to stay with us over the next few years as we try to turn this thing around, because the friction of policymaking, particularly the kind of policymaking we need, is pretty severe. And without that kind of people power, you can't break through it.
I'd love, Jared, to ask you to kind of follow up on that, because Ivan, I think you very smartly talked about the friction, and perhaps the people power is the only grease that's going to make that friction go away or be tolerable, I suppose. So Jared, could you speak a little bit to the kind of partnerships that you see as most effective when you're pushing through policy at the state level in California around climate? What is that kind of partnership with the people power, and tell us about the importance of that role in moving your the state's agenda forward around climate action?
Yeah, it's a as Miya said, like we could spend hours on this particular issue. I just say, when my son Marcus, he's now studying urban environmental policy at Occidental, but when he was in school, in primary school at Rooftop in San Francisco, activists came in and said to him, an environmental activist, it's now up to you, the next generation, to solve these difficult issues like climate change. And he actually stood up. I was pretty proud of him. And he's like, no, it's still up to you guys. You caused the problem. Well, we're just kids. Like, why are you telling it's up to us? So like, as much as Greta and others, I think the anger is like not to say that it's up to them, because it's still up to all of us. So in any job that we have, anyone who's listening, literally there isn't, it used to be, and I think if you track kind of the history of the environmental movement, we wanted to protect somewhere else, basically for white men to enjoy parks and hunting. That was like the national park movement. And then we kind of realized that urban environments, starting in California, you couldn't breathe in LA, 50 years ago. So we came out with the Clean Air Act. And now it's really not an environmental movement. This is a social equity economic movement across everything we do. And if we confine it to thinking about, oh, this is the environment, we will fail, right? This is about every single facet of, Corinne talked about, when we live in a very consumer-based economy, right? 64% of our GDP is based on household consumption. The only other place that has as high is Saudi Arabia. So most other places have a more diversified economy. We buy tons and tons of crap we don't need. That stuff ends up in landfill. And that is our economy. So when you're ordering from Amazon, when you're thinking about the food that we eat, how your kids got to school, like literally every facet of our life contributes in some way to this challenge. And that's why it's so complex. So when I think about probably the people in the Battery, like, this guy's completely insane. What the job that Corinne and Miya play for me is to make me look like I'm in the center. So the more they can push, the more I can focus and help legislators and the governor and others see, like, we are not moving fast enough or bold enough or comprehensive enough. And there's lots of things that we still need to solve to, right? Start oil and gas extraction in the state. How do we move towards goods movement? 41% of all the containers into the United States come into California and then go to the rest of the country. But if you live next to a port, or if you live next to a rail corridor, or if you live next to a highway, you're more likely than not to be a person of color and low income and have distinctly different mortality and life outcomes and health outcomes than someone else. So for me, it is really showing that this is fundamental to everything we do in the state. It can't be made boutique. Like if this is just Berkeley and Santa Monica and San Francisco doing the thing, it's not going to work. It has to be the Central Valley. It has to be Crescent City and Bakersfield and Coachella. So really making sure, because what we've done is we've kind of made this, the vestige of the environmental movement in the state is white elites in coastal cities. And that's how it's perceived as a movement. And that's who has Teslas, and that's who, you know, is going to care about these issues. But why aren't we focused on making sure that electric vehicles are in low-income communities? Like, how do we do that? The way we do that is to really get and show that people around the state care about this. This is an equity and economic and social justice issue, as well as an environment issue. So the more we have everyone from innovators to financiers to moms to kids all saying this is the direction we need to go, it opens up a space for policy to happen. And my view of why that's important is because if California does it, eventually the rest of the nation is going to do it. We've seen that with nearly every issue, from clean vehicles to marriage equality, and we need to keep that pressure going. So California can really be that innovator that helps push the rest of the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's so important to impress the point that you made about that this is all interconnected. You know, it is a social, economic, racial, climate, justice issue. They're all totally connected. And we try to kind of parse them apart, which maybe we're even guilty of here by saying this is about climate action. That we will fail and that we have to look at all of these together. And Corinne, I feel like your work is very much at the intersection of all of those things. So I'd love to get, you know, your chime in on what we're talking about here as far as the critical importance of this people power to make change in this moment.
Yes. Yeah, I was like all of these going off. Miya talking about the importance of movements. You know, Ivan, you know, with the markets, Jared, again, like with the role of agencies and how communities are pushing them, and just all of the different factors that actually influence change, movement, organizing, that these things, because issues and impacts are multifaceted and not monolithic, neither can our solutions and our approaches, right? And so the more that we, within an ecosystem, right, both ecological and social, that we are existing within the same system, and recognize the inequities within it, the better we're able to understand actually what it's going to take in our roles to shift it. And the more aligned we are in that, the more change and the more impact we're going to have, right? Because then we're not at odds, you know, trying to like debate about like, you know, how do we define climate change? Well, what's climate justice versus climate, and all of those things. And one of the things that I've seen more and more now is that we have done a really good job. And again, this goes back to the people power around narrative, right? You know, people power, it's like just on a basic level, it's a vital force. You know, it's the lifeblood. It's the story that makes, honors, tells history, right? And we've been doing a lot more of that. Why? Because history, you know, within a white supremacist system has been repeating itself. And so I think then we're able to kind of have a daylight of like, oh, well, climate, you know, 10 years ago, climate was about the polar bears and the ice caps. Like that was literally like the driven framing. It was also about peak oil, right? Which now is like irrelevant because, you know, oil industry, that's what we thrive on the economy. We're going to find a way, right? Like that's not finite anymore. So again, I think like all of those different moments, which were fueled by movements, fueled by challenges of saying like this narrative is divisive. This narrative is incorrect. This narrative is not accessible to those that are most impacted, I think allowed for the centering of people, which allowed for just understanding and acknowledging and harnessing the power that exists there. because instead of our power being adversary and trying to like figure out what conversation we were even having about climate, or even whether it was real or not, or how economic and housing and food and health is in relationship and actually exacerbated by climate, by the system, by the actual like economic system we live within. Once we got there, once we started connecting the dots, then we were able to kind of literally have movements where we were reflecting more comprehensive solutions. And so, right, back in 2014, Miya was at the table and I was at Root and Resilience, right, in that room in MSC, and we were like, we're all experiencing this in different ways, right? Whether we're fighting against like, oh, we need energy democracy, whether we're fighting like, you know, against like Chevron and the refinery, you know, whether we're fighting, you know, to make sure that like young people are like having a say at protecting their spaces and also influencing planning. So we were doing this in different ways. And one thing that was central is that we were all experiencing not being at the table from the beginning, right? We were kind of brought in and they were like, oh, you know, like, what do you think? And it created more gaps. So we came together, we shared our experience of like, what does it actually mean to actually have community-driven processes? What is at the core of this type of community-driven work, even in partnership with philanthropy, even in partnership when we're intervening with agencies or partnering with government, or businesses or multi-stakeholder tables. And what we found was kind of synthesize what we call our community-driven climate resilience planning engine, right? Which is like vision, power, and solutions, right? That we need to all kind of come and align on, and a lot of what movements have at the heart. And this one is no different. The one that Miya just talked about, that was like years and years in the making, with different movements behind the scenes as a part of like what happened in Georgia, what happened nationally with this election, or even just getting out to vote, right? All those communities responsible is that they had shared community vision of community priorities, things that they needed to have actually happen. They built power specifically within their base, but also power with those that were partnering and had power within governments, having those conversations. They figured out strategically how to build power both inside and outside. And then solutions, the solutions reflected that. Whether they kind of were moving the needle within kind of political strategy, or making sure that we're having more progressive candidates there, having that conversation inside, building those solutions so that they were comprehensive and reflective, so that we're no longer having, like you said, Colleen, these conversations in silos, and we're no longer debating about the relationship, but we're more critically starting to think about, how do we center community? How do we center people? How do we put equity first? And then by doing so and having the right people at the table doing this together, you know, our movements can make more impact, and each of us play a role in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up narrative. We had an expert at a few months ago in one of these similar sessions, and she said something that I will never forget, and it just seems so relevant across everything, which is narrative eats policy for breakfast, which I thought was just a brilliant way of putting it. But Jared, I want to turn back to you, because we're talking about this very, you know, interconnected nature of all these different issues, and you actually brought it up in the first place. How does that work for you as someone who kind of, you know, at least from your title, it sounds like you were the head of a siloed, you know, issue, which is, you know, climate for the state of California. So like, how do you tackle the interconnected nature and work towards solutions that recognize, honor, and address that, and not become siloed because, you know, you're the head of this one particular thing?
Well, just starting with President Biden, who kind of epitomizes this style. It's a cabinet-wide initiative on climate change. So if you look at how he's approaching it, and I think how California has, this isn't just at US EPA or Interior or the Department of Energy or Transportation or Housing. It's also in Commerce. It's also in Education. Like, it's also in the Department of Agriculture. So it's in every single one, and that's because if you're a farmer right now in California or anywhere else in the country, you're feeling climate change right now, right? And if you're at the Federal Reserve, you realize that economic stability requires, as Miya said, a stable climate. If you're, at the post office, and your employees are getting overly hot when they're delivering the mail, you're going to care about climate change. So the goal is, it used to be siloed. We have some regulatory authority in agencies like the Air Resources Board and the Water Board and other kind of traditional environmental agencies. But certainly every day I work with Karen, who's the secretary of Ag, and Wade, who's at Resources, and David Kim, who's at Transportation. So we have a climate cabinet, the Office of Planning and Research, Kate Gordon. So there's a whole team of people that are thinking about these issues. And right at the moment, we're having some pretty active discussions with a whole host of people around how we think about decarbonizing our building sector, our home sector. And so the housing folks, the housing equity, like how do you make sure California, which has a huge housing shortage, how do we build more homes, but make sure those homes aren't connected to fossil fuels? So all those things, the electricity grid, it really keeps going and going and going. So the more this intersectionality that we're talking about has to exist, not only between, justice and societal issues and the economy and climate, it also needs to exist intersectionally between all the different participating agencies. And that's really hard, Colleen, because people aren't used to doing that. And those silos have existed statutorily. So all the statutes protecting the environment are very siloed, and they're lawyers that only understand hazardous waste facilities, and engineers like Mia's dad who focus on, this is an engineering solution for this facility. But what we need to do is bring everyone together to think about, why are we producing hazardous waste in the first place? Why is that hazardous waste facility in a low-income community of color? Like, all these things, whether we connect them or not, are connected. And so our obligation is to understand the inherent synergies between all these issues and kind of tackle them in both in a way that can be accountable, but also in a way that recognizes that many different parties need to be at the table.
Yeah. Thank you. And now we started by talking about that we are in this moment. We have this moment of opportunity that's been building up for a long time. That's been building up because of the organizing and movement building and power building of people that you all described so nicely. I want to talk about, like, now that we have this moment, how do we seize it? And from each, I'd like to hear from each of you, from each of your spheres, and the angle that you take at this. How do you foresee that we can, seize that, and what are you doing to seize that? I know it's a big question. I recognize that, but I'd love to hear your crack at it. And Miya, can I ask you to start, maybe?
I'll give it a go. Yeah, I think I just want to go back a second and just say, it does seem very, of course it's complicated. The world is a complicated place. There's a lot of complicated intersecting systemic problems that we've created that have entrenched inequality. That same system of entrenched interests is what sustains the systems that support climate change too. So what enables the same systems that enable us to be in this position of facing this catastrophic future are the same systems that entrench inequality. So I don't know, make it overly, like, of course we have to align strategies. We have to look at solutions to climate change as being much more comprehensive and holistic, and we have to certainly start with centering on the communities who have been most impacted by the systems that create climate change. So, for instance, communities who have been at the center of the fossil fuel industry, who've been most impacted by pipelines, refineries, mining oil and gas, and consult those communities what do they want? How do they want to transform their communities? What are the solutions that work best for them? And not pretend that we have all of the solutions for everybody, and we're just going to, in a top-down way, enforce that set of solutions. But it is comprehensive, but it's also very elegantly simple too. It's like, we have to address inequality. We have to put the people who have been most impacted at the core of the solutions. People who have actually, when given the opportunity, have beautiful, creative, imaginative solutions to this crisis. It is not, the solutions don't need to come from somewhere else. We need experts to support the solutions, not to drive the solutions. We don't need experts to tell us, the best way to get to the healthy communities. These communities already know what's best for them, and as long as we're driving that at the core, I think we will be able to actually address this crisis in a way that we haven't tried to tackle. And I think, just to use an example for kind of what's right in front of us, and it's connected to the climate crisis, but we have to have an economic recovery that actually solves the crisis and benefits essential workers, the care that builds and supports the caring economy, that actually delivers solutions to people in their everyday lives. And we can do that in a way that actually addresses some of the biggest aspects of the climate crisis too. We can do that in a way that enables people to have good paying jobs, that builds new clean energy infrastructure in our local neighborhoods, that can benefit people who are being impacted by the pandemic with cleaner air so that their lungs are not filled with pollution while they're also trying to fight the pandemic. We have all these solutions at our fingertips that are, just as climate change is a threat multiplier in many directions, the solutions can be a solution multiplier. So there are ways that we can address this, driven by the real everyday needs of people. That should be our constant driver, and the thing that we keep coming back to.
Yes, I guess that is elegantly simple, isn't it? Listen to the people who are most impacted. Ivan, can I turn to you from your perspective in the financial markets, and the work that you do? How are you in your role seizing the opportunity, and what do you see as success?
First, I want to kind of challenge a little bit the opportunity thing, not to be all Debbie Downer on this, but I feel like some of that comes from the idea that, Joe Biden's now in the White House, and we have climate cabinets and incredible personnel, and we have the Senate by the skin of our teeth. And, and just to level set here, we, the decade of 2010 was a totally lost decade in terms of climate. So we lost a climate bill where we had a bigger majority in the House. We had a much bigger majority in the Senate, like 57, 58 Democratic senators. I mean, we were close to 60, right? And so, and we had a kind of tripartisan thing, right? You remember Kerry, Graham, Lieberman, and like whatever mishmash that was, like they were all in. And so, but we have, that was, in many ways, that was the opportunity. That was when what we needed to do was reduce emissions by 3% a year. And now we need to reduce emissions by 8% a year, right? I mean, it is like it's not an opportunity as much as this is the biggest do-over we've ever been given. And it's not like a do-over that gets easier the second time you do it, right? This isn't like, oh, I screwed up making a bundt cake, and so now I'm going to try to master the bundt cake again. Now I've got to do some British Bake Off challenge type thing, having just screwed up bundt cake. And so it is really hard what we're about to do. The for me, we're very focused on the kind of climate at the COP, and that is the the big sort of the do-over of the Paris Climate Agreement, or the re-up of the Paris Climate Agreement, and that is where a lot of the private sector, global policy, everything sort of focused in this sort of run-up to the Conference of the Parties, and all in the frame of net zero. So everything that we engage with, the companies where we are managing assets that are owners of companies, we're doing shareholder engagement to push companies towards net zero. In the banking sector, we are kind of organizing to push for banks to make net zero commitments, to kind of measure, manage, disclose, target their financed emissions, get out of fossil fuels. Like all of those pieces come together at the COP. And I think what success looks like is something, Jared, you mentioned earlier. It's like kind of we need all of us in this. So I feel like over the course of this year, we need all of these things to kind of click perfectly, right? We need to kind of be on our A game in Washington and A game in the States. We need the people-powered movements piling on and keeping the pressure on. We need businesses to kind of like lean into this until it hurts and then some. We need everybody to kind of be a part of this thing. And then I think we can make the most of this do-over. And if we, as we've been talking about, if we do it right, we don't just avert a kind of climate catastrophe, but we actually end up with a more just, equitable, sustainable economy and society. And that's probably the real, that's the real drive here. So I feel it's not fully an opportunity, but it's all hands on deck. So great time for battery powered to be focused on this issue.
Yeah, I'll never look at a bundt cake the same, Ivan.
Especially one of mine.
Yeah, exactly. Corinne, could I turn to you? I'd love to get your thoughts on this, and especially with the work the very community-based work that you do, and the solution and the work that you do to come up with help communities come up with their own solutions. I'd love to hear more about your focus there and what you see as success over the next several years in the work you do.
Yes, thank you. I think again, we are in a better moment, right? And we still need to continue lifting up those models that are really challenging the traditional planning structure, which is top down, right? Which, what is grounded in white supremacy, and really make sure that we're creating new systems, we're practicing new systems that allow for new models where everyone can benefit. And I think we're starting to move the needle by even just improving the way planning happens, by having, communities at the table. But I think what this opportunity and this moment of opportunity, right? Because these are when kind of we take this time to kind of say that we actually need to accelerate the rate at which we do this, and have concentrated invested effort in it, is when I think of what success looks like, I think of Marin City, right? Just to kind of give an example, it being a Black community with a disinvested community, right? With flooding and just economic, everything in terms of infrastructure, right? Falling apart within the most affluent county, right? And seeing how, from 2018, them being able to lead a process to develop a people's plan and an organization, I think back in 2018, right, where they were actually adapting this idea of how do we actually model success of when we say community-driven planning, communities driving the process, communities making the decisions, communities identifying the impacts and the solutions, communities shifting how we value and the narrative of how we value expertise, and understanding that this specific community in Marin City knew the most than any technical expert or scientific expert that you could bring in, because they were bringing lived experience that was grounded in both the ecology, the environment, the people, and also kind of the non-human elements of where they were existing for years, right? So to a certain extent, they knew things that codes of cities and technical measurements could not project, right? So how do we shift and look at stories like this where they were able to essentially create a people's plan, right? To really help, specifically around the issue of flooding, really turn the traditional top-down planning process on its head and do so in a way that supports that local wisdom to actually lead planning and project implementation. And I think so success requires looking at these models and scaling them up, where you actually have a people's plan that is leading, and it's an asset to, and it's a starting point to allow for like asset owners and municipalities and stakeholders who can actually see community members as leaders, right? Instead of kind of just participants in a planning process. And so I think we need more of that investment in that type of work, because we already see what's been made possible under like the most extreme conditions in a community. And we have this spectrum of community engagement to ownership where I see Marin City as, we have 0 to 5. 0 is kind of like ignore. You've got some tokenization in there when working kind of with cities in terms of communities experience. And then 5 is like defer to. 4 is collaborate, which, we're doing a lot of now. But 5 is defer to. And I think that Marin City really does tell that story of like, what does it look like when you actually defer to the expertise in a community to create a plan that is actually going to meet the needs of municipalities, cities, government, and all of these things that you're trying to figure out in a room without them.
Yeah, that's a great example. Thanks for sharing such a concrete one. I know that technically, like, we have a few more minutes until we go to audience Q&A, but there was one ask that, like, I don't want to go a second further until we address it. And that is giving some specific examples of how people of color and other minorities are harmed by climate issues in an inequitable way. Because if one person's asking it, plenty of people have the question, and I want to make sure that that important point is covered. I know you all can say lots about it. Who wants to jump in first?
I'm happy to give a super big overview. So there's a great tool, and we'll put it in the chat, called CalEnviroScreen. So this concept of environmental justice, which may be new to some of the listeners, is basically that where you live, your zip code really is a determinant of your health outcomes. And that even in a county, let's just pick Alameda County, which is right across the bay from San Francisco. In that county, your health outcome based on your color of your skin and your income level can differ. If you're white and live in Alameda County, you have 21 years on average longer life than a person of color or low income person in that same county, in Alameda, in California, one of the wealthiest, the 5th largest economy in the United States. So the frame, if you look at it's in the chat, CalEnviroScreen, you can see these cumulative environmental impacts. So how close do you live to a hazardous waste facility? Do you have drinking water that meets standards that are set by the federal government? A whole host of issues relating to chemicals, pollution. If you just pick the issue of diesel particulate, right? So diesel trucks and the particulate matter, and look at the routes that those trucks take through a community. Those trucks are not going through, the marina. They're not going through Pacific Heights. They're going through the Bayview in San Francisco. They're going through East Oakland to the ports in Oakland. So the communities that were redlined, so there was actual federal practices that prohibited communities from living in certain places and required that they live in communities that were close to pollution sources. Those communities are more often than not, and if you look at the state of California, even in our state, which feels very progressive, the communities that have the biggest burden environmentally are communities of color and low-income communities. And so when you look at, just the final point would be the cross-section between air pollution. So twice as many people die of air pollution in California as do from vehicles than do getting killed in cars. So that air pollution exacerbates COVID. And when you look at who is dying from COVID and getting COVID in our state, it's overwhelmingly Latinx, and then African American, and then other communities following behind. And so those things, air pollution actually, and those impacts of air pollution, which we see in our state, affect low-income communities and communities of color. Those actually lead to increased mortality of COVID. So you could do a map of the United States, and actually this was done at the beginning of the environmental justice movement, and show just by where hazardous waste facilities are located, where communities of color are. That single indicator, unfortunately, is an indicator of where communities of color live. So because of the issues that Miya and Corinne talked about, lack of empowerment, lack of political voice within the society that we have, for a whole set of systemic racial reasons, communities haven't been able to fight back and say, we don't want the wastewater treatment plant. We don't want the hazardous waste facility. And so this connection between poor environmental outcomes and race is unfortunately indelibly connected.
Thank you, Jared. Does anybody else want to chime in and continue on that question?
I mean, that was pretty comprehensive, so I don't need to. I think that was a good explanation. Just want to build off of something that's particular to the Bay Area. I mean, there's other places in the U.S. that this is true, but communities who have borne the brunt of pollution have been both like systemically disinvested in. So there is a lack of investment in other things that create healthy communities, like grocery stores where you have access to healthy food, like just other accessible parks and places to walk, and all the walkable cities and public transportation, all of the parts of the infrastructure that actually add to both the health outcomes in a local community. That infrastructure, there's been a history, as Jared was saying, based on public policy that has disinvested in those communities and not just made them targets for industry and pollution, but have created a systemic disinvestment in the health and wealth of that community. And also the thing that we're facing is that when there are efforts, and I'm going to bring Corinne back into the whole planning aspect of this, when there are efforts, well-intentioned efforts to talk about how do we build sustainable cities and neighborhoods that are climate friendly and that have public transportation and housing that's sustainable and that has renewable energy on it. When we start building those neighborhoods, we are building neighborhoods for people who are moving in, not for the people who live there. And there is a history of displacement and gentrification that we have to, that's part of looking at climate in an equity lens, and how important it is to engage communities in the process of defining what their future looks like and what is the healthy, thriving community that they want. Because if you upgrade a building with renewable energy and a great gray water system, and that increases the value of that building, which is great, but that also has to be accompanied with tenant protections, with policies that are actually going to help people stay in their homes and actually benefit from some of the transformation that we're trying to attempt to address the climate crisis and build healthy places. So just wanted to add that in.
I wanted to turn to a question that both I have and one of our audience members has, which is and I'd love for each of you, if you could quickly, attempt to quickly answer this question, which is, what do you see as philanthropy's role in all of this work that we've been talking about? Of course, the issues are huge, and philanthropy is a small piece of that. But where do you see it being most effective in each of the kind of spheres that you work in? Corinne, I'll start with you this time.
Thank you. A lot of what I've been seeing more so now is, there have been some great funders that have really been trying to be transformational in how they're doing things different in philanthropy, and also influencing the field by doing those things differently that actually model what we've been talking about in terms of planning, which is like partnership and collaboration, right? That, when we think about investments, when we think about where resources need to flow, and when we understand, like, I know for Movement Strategy Center, like part of our theory of changes is like moving those resources directly to community as much as possible, and partnering with philanthropy and like how they can do that, how we can be facilitators in that, where they don't have the relationships directly with community to do that, how we can remove the barriers that often, prohibit very easy access from those grassroots organizations that are focused on movement building and don't necessarily have the organizational capacity to go through all of the different processes of getting that funding, or have such small budgets that they're deemed a liability, or not a safe investment for the work that is crucially needed, right? So those are just kind of some ways that I feel like some funders and philanthropy has really stepped up to really say, I know that there's a better way to do this, and I'm not really sure how. And I want to learn from others in philanthropy who have been able to partner with either intermediaries that work directly with grassroots organizations, or some grassroots organizations themselves, and really try to do things different. And so what's that kind of look like is like adjusting grant guidelines, and like how you're even putting RFPs out, making sure that they're accessible and seen, making sure the application process is like super easy, things like that, and continuing to have like roundtables, peer learning discussions with other funders to share these experiences so that they can do a little bit better at the investments, and also take better approaches to what sustained investment can actually look like that's not being crippling. And more specifically, I'll say is that oftentimes in philanthropy, we see that, priority areas change about every 3 years, right? So how do we make sure that, we're partnering with philanthropy either as an intermediary to shift the tendency to do that, and understand the crippling effect that might have on an organization that depends on that investment, because then the work doesn't get done. And part of that is getting philanthropy to understand, and they're already starting to kind of do a better job of this, is with kind of multi-year investments, is that the process, like the planning that you're investing in as a funder in philanthropy, and the journey with an organization is just as important as the outcomes and the deliverables that you want in that, so that the investment must match those and align with those things.
Excellent words of wisdom, not just for climate-focused philanthropy. Thank you, Corinne. Ivan, could I turn to you next on that question? What do you see as philanthropy's role in this climate action, and what needs to happen?
I mean, it is, I sort of have the same answer as Corinne, which is a broader answer than more climate specific, but I feel I'm involved with a network, Confluence Philanthropy, which is asset owners and investment practitioners, and it's very focused on impact investing, but and we're trying to transform the way we use capital in society, right, to achieve a more just, equitable, fair society. Where that work with the money becomes really powerful is where it's connected to activism, right, where we understand social movements and align that with investment decisions and philanthropy, and put those things together. And so I think that creates for a more powerful approach to the sort of philanthropic purpose. It's really about sort of taking the 95% and the 5% and thinking about it more holistically, and really keeping kind of people-centered politics at the heart of it. So I think that is that's sort of a truism, of philanthropy, but it's particularly important in this moment.
Thanks, Ivan. And Jared, could I turn to you now?
All I'm going to say is my latest hero is Mackenzie Scott. I just love her. Like she works out who she wants to fund, and she just sends them the check. Like literally, Miya and Corinne just spend so much time writing reports to foundations about like what widget they've created. Like just once you trust the people, just give them the money, let them do what they need to do. Give it to as local as you can and grassroots. Like sometimes I think it's easier to feel like I'm going to give to a big national group I've heard of and my friends are on the board, but I wouldn't think that that's the best way. You want to give agency and voice to people. To Corinne's point, the Marin City People's Climate Plan on sea level rise is probably more impactful than any World Wildlife Fund report that you could think of. And so finding that place to donate locally where you can get engaged. And mainly I just say the reason that I'm a big Mackenzie Scott fan is not only of the style, but like just be engaged. Like this is not a time to sit on the sidelines. This is not, right? We have to answer the call to public service, and funding people who have that passion, that knowledge, that ability to shape and change the future is what we need to do. So the first thing I'd say is just do it. Just do it. Just like whatever capacity you have, it's going to help. And literally, there are organizations that you give $2,000 to that can sustain them, unfortunately, for like a month. It shouldn't be able to, but people are really working on crazy tight budgets right now. Really hard time for fundraising. So anything you can do is going to be appreciated. And sometimes, if you're going to just that, I have a lot of friends who are environmental artists, and like someone who wants to make a piece of music about climate change, someone who wants to do a painting or a photography exhibition about climate change, someone who wants to, open a farmer's market stall, to sell lemons that are collected around San Francisco. I mean, literally, someone who's going to start a bicycle repair shop, someone who's going to fund urban ore to get reclaimed stuff so it doesn't all go to the landfill. I mean, it can be nearly anything that you could think of. So get engaged, enjoy it. They're amazing people, as you've seen from Corinne and Miya in this space, and fund them often, keep funding them, and stay engaged.
Miya, the last word on what philanthropy should be doing in this space.
Well, let's see. To say something that I agree with what's already been said. I think that the philanthropic space has to be transformed just like all the other spaces do. So we need to work together to actually create a transformation of how philanthropy is done. So like the question is really relevant to the whole, how we're going to approach solving the crisis together. How are we going to be in partnership? I think there's one real important reorientation to philanthropy, and that is that we are all, it's not just we're all in this together, but we need to change the relationships of power between philanthropy and communities. That there's of course historic disinvestment in communities that actually drive the power that we need to build the most right now to get to the solutions that we all need. So that's part of the history. But what is I want to give a shout out to a few. I see that David Beckman is on the call, so I wanted to give a shout out to Mosaic, Katali Fund Solutions Project, the People of Color Donor Network. These are all funds that I've been personally engaged with that are reorienting around a different relationship to the transfer of wealth, and that this is something that is not a charitable action. It is an action completely driven by mutual self-interest that like we need each other, the practitioners, the people who are organizing for power on the ground, the people who have the solutions. We need to be in partnership. And so decision making and how that power to decide where those funds go is really important to detach from the way we're doing it right now. I would also say Lieber Foundation and the Chorus Foundation are two great examples of private philanthropy that has really reoriented into the more equitable partnership idea. And so it's not just, it is important to like give multi-year grants, reduce the amount of crap that people have to do to, you know, but really it's about being in real relationship with, and that we're in a strategy together, and that we all have to succeed together. And being in that orientation, I think, turns philanthropy on its head and reorients it to, I think, a more healthy way of actually looking at how we're going to solve the problem.
Lots of homework for us philanthropists out there. Thank you. That's very, very inspiring, and a call to action that I think we all are trying to and should heed. So thank you for sharing that. I've been kind of sprinkling in the audience questions as we go, and I think we have time to hit just one more before we have to wrap up. So I wanted to get to a friend of ours here, our anonymous friend. They wanted to talk about the appropriate role of science and tech innovation to support community-based solutions. Is there low-hanging fruit to pursue via community science collaborations with policy traction? I'm not sure who would be best to speak to that. Does that spark an interest or a thought for any of you that you want to share?
Miya, maybe you could talk about Miss Margaret Gordon and the Community Indicators Project in West Oakland, or Corinne. Like, that seemed like a great kind of collaboration.
I'm embarrassed. I got distracted for a second. Can you repeat the question, Colleen?
Yeah, sure. No, it's they wanted to know about the appropriate role of science and tech innovation to support community-based solutions. Is there low-hanging fruit to pursue via community science collaboration?
Yeah, so the example that Jared was talking about is one of these under-resourced community-based organizations has actually really been driving in West Oakland, they're a fence line community to the Port of Oakland, and like call back to some of the earlier stuff we were talking about how transportation in California and the Bay Area really concentrates pollution in certain communities. And so this is one of those communities, and there are a number of people, including Ms. Margaret Gordon, who have been really instrumental in actually partnering with scientists, with policymakers on community-driven processes to create solutions and policy interventions to actually really change the lived conditions in those communities and actually dramatically try to reduce the amount of pollution that kids are breathing in and going to local hospitals because of asthma attacks every day. But like the point is that it is really community taking control over both the defining what the problem is and the solutions, and then having scientific partners and other forms of resources and other types of expertise that actually get driven by that community ground truthing and the lessons that are coming out of local communities. So they do organizing around the actual policies that they've developed, and are really significantly influencing the way some of the state policy around local pollution. It's a little too technical, I won't get into it, but like it's really interesting the model that they've developed. And I'll just say, like, there are a number of academics in California who have worked in true partnership with communities, who before they come up with a policy paper that comes up with solutions to go to the state legislature or something, that they're driven by and created by local communities and community needs.
Excellent. I really appreciate that. It's so helpful to get those clear, specific examples. So thanks for sharing that, Miya and Jared. I am afraid our time is up. I actually can't believe it. It has gone so fast because you guys have been so interesting to talk to. I want to thank you so very much for joining us. Like you all have mentioned, the time is now. There is so much to be done. And we need to move faster than we can, even imagine, and that you have given us an hour and a half of your time is amazing and incredible. And so thank you so much for doing that. We know you have a lot on your plates. I do want to mention to our audience that's joining us, thanks for joining. We have, this is of course the first event in our theme on climate action, which will last for the next couple of months and will culminate in us making grants to organizations in March. So the next up event is going to be on February 23rd. That's organization night, when our 12 finalist organizations will present to us virtually on Zoom. So mark your calendars for that, February 23rd. But even before that, this Wednesday evening, we actually will be having a special session about impact investing and in the climate space. So we wanted to add that into our lineup of events this time around because of the particular role that impact investing can play in climate action. So if you're interested in that and interested in how philanthropy and impact investing can complement one another in this space, please join us on Wednesday night, 5 p.m. It's up on the Battery website. You can RSVP there. It's going to be a great talk in partnership with our friends at Tonic. I think that's it. I don't think we have our 12 finalists were just posted today on our website. So you can go there and see the 12 incredible organizations, some of whom were mentioned today, and who we will be considering for funding. And we'll be putting lots more information up about them soon. So stay tuned. I think those are all of my reminders. So with that, I will just once again say thank you to our phenomenal panelists. And thank you to our audience and all of your great questions. And I wish you all a wonderful night. Stay healthy, stay well, and hope to see you soon.